3 minutes to midnight, exactly as she had done every New Year's Eve for as long as Louisa Finch could remember, Odette quietly excused herself from the living room, where the rest of the family had gathered with drinks and half-watched television countdowns, and made her way down the hallway to the small study at the back of the house. Louisa followed her part way, as she had done more times over the years than she could count, standing just outside the study door, close enough to watch without being seen, a habit formed sometime in her own childhood and never fully abandoned. She watched her mother sit down at the small desk and reach for the worn leather address book that lived in the drawer beneath it, the same address book Louisa had watched her retrieve every New Year's Eve of her entire life. This year, something was different. Odette opened the book and began flipping through its pages slowly, her brow furrowed, her fingers moving with a hesitation Louisa had never once witnessed before. She turned past several pages, paused, turned back, murmured something under her breath that Louisa couldn't quite make out, and continued searching. For 30 years, as far as Louisa understood the tradition, her mother had dialed this same number from memory, needing the address book only as a formality, a physical anchor to a ritual that had long since become automatic. This year, for the first time, she seemed to have genuinely lost the number somewhere in her own memory, requiring the physical page in front of her to recover it. She found it eventually, her expression settling into relief, and dialed the number slowly on the cordless phone beside her, her finger moving with careful, deliberate precision across each digit. The phone began to ring, faintly audible through the study door. Odette held the receiver to her ear and said nothing, simply sat, listening to it ring, her expression distant and unreadable, the way it had looked every year Louisa had ever secretly witnessed this ritual. Louisa checked her watch out of the same old habit she developed as a teenager, timing the call the way she always had, though she'd never once told her mother she did this. 1 minute, exactly 1 minute of ringing, no answer. And then Odette set the receiver down gently, closed the address book, and returned it to its drawer. She rejoined the family in the living room moments later, just as the television countdown reached its final seconds, smiling and accepting a hug from her grandson as the new year arrived, giving no indication that anything unusual had just occurred. Louisa stood alone in the hallway for a moment longer, thinking about the specific, unfamiliar hesitation in her mother's hands as she'd searched the address book's pages, and understood, with a quiet, urgent clarity that hadn't fully formed in her before that exact moment, that whatever story lived behind that yearly unanswered call might not remain available to ask about for very much longer. Louisa Finch was 51 years old, a pediatric nurse at the regional hospital, married for 26 years to a steady, patient man named Grant, mother to a 17-year-old son, Milo, who had grown up, as Louisa herself had, entirely unaware of the specific story behind his grandmother's private New Year's Eve ritual. Louisa had witnessed the ritual for as long as she could remember, absorbed into the ordinary architecture of her family's holiday traditions, the way children absorb most of their family's unexplained customs, without particular scrutiny, simply as one of the unremarkable fixed points of who her mother was. Odette disappeared to the study at 3 minutes to midnight every New Year's Eve, returned a few minutes later, and the family's celebration continued uninterrupted, an arrangement so consistent across Louisa's entire life that she had genuinely never once considered directly asking her mother what it meant. She had noticed other things about her mother over the decades that she had similarly never connected into a larger picture. Odette had always maintained an intense, specific vigilance around fire safety that Louisa, as a child, had found faintly embarrassing compared to her friends' more relaxed households. Extra smoke detectors installed in every room, a strict non-negotiable rule about never leaving candles unattended even for a moment, a household fire extinguisher kept in a highly visible location in the kitchen that Odette checked and replaced with a regularity bordering on ritual. Odette had never enjoyed fireworks, had always found some gentle excuse to stay indoors during any 4th of July display, and had never once, in Louisa's entire childhood, allowed New Year's Eve to become the loud, boisterous celebration many of Louisa's friends' families indulged in. No fireworks, no loud countdown parties, simply a quiet gathering of close family, the same modest tradition repeated year after year without variation. Louisa had grown into an adult who carried, without ever fully examining its origin, a similar heightened concern around fire safety in her own household, an anxiety Grant occasionally teased her about gently, the extra smoke detectors in Milo's bedroom, the specific, careful rules Louisa had enforced throughout Milo's childhood about space heaters and unattended stoves, rules Louisa herself had never once traced back to any particular source, simply accepting them as her own personal caution, rather than an inheritance passed down, unexamined, across 2 generations. Odette had begun showing small, concerning signs of memory difficulty over the preceding year, misplaced keys, a repeated story told twice within the same conversation, a specific afternoon the previous spring when she had briefly, disorientingly, forgotten which of her 2 grandchildren was visiting that day before the confusion lifted as suddenly as it had arrived. A doctor's evaluation several months earlier had confirmed what the family had already begun quietly suspecting, the early stages of a cognitive decline that would, in all likelihood, continue to progress, gradually, over the coming years. Louisa had not yet fully processed what this diagnosis meant for the countless small, unexplained pieces of her mother's history that had never been directly discussed. Understanding, watching her mother's unsteady hand search an address book for a number she'd apparently dialed from memory for 3 decades, that some of those pieces might soon become permanently unavailable, lost not through any deliberate choice to keep them private, but simply through the slow, ordinary erosion of memory itself. Louisa asked her mother directly the following week, sitting together in Odette's kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the specific urgency of the previous week's observations still sitting uncomfortably in her chest. "I want to ask you something," she said, choosing her words carefully, "about the phone call you make every New Year's Eve, the number in your address book. I've noticed it my whole life, and I've never asked, and I think I'd like to know now, if you're willing to tell me." Odette went very still for a moment, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she'd stopped drinking from. "You've noticed that," she said, not quite a question. "Every year," Louisa admitted, "since I was young enough to sneak down the hallway and watch. I never told you I knew. I always assumed it was private, and I didn't want to intrude." Odette was quiet for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at nothing in particular. "I think I'm glad you're finally asking," she said finally. "I think I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask without ever quite finding the words to bring it up myself." She paused, gathering something in herself before continuing. "I had a brother, Wesley. He was 3 years younger than me. We grew up in a house not far from here. It isn't there anymore, or rather, a different house is there now, rebuilt after what happened." She stopped again, and Louisa waited, understanding that whatever came next needed to arrive at its own pace. "There was a fire," Odette said finally, her voice steady but carrying a weight Louisa had rarely heard from her. "New Year's Eve. I was 15. Wesley was 12. Our parents were out at a neighbor's party for a few hours, and I was supposed to be watching him. I left the room to use the bathroom, only for a few minutes, that's all it was. And by the time I came back, the fire had already started, faster than anyone could have predicted, faster than any of us understood a fire could actually move. I got out. Wesley didn't." Louisa felt her own breath catch, the specific, quiet devastation of the sentence settling slowly into the room. "I've spent 60 years believing, on some level, that those few minutes were mine to answer for," Odette continued. "I know logically that a 15-year-old using the bathroom for a few minutes isn't responsible for a house fire. I've been told that by every counselor I ever spoke to about it, back when speaking to counselors about such things was still considered unusual. But knowing something logically and actually believing it in your chest are 2 very different things, and I don't think I've ever fully closed that gap Not in 60 years. The phone number, Louisa said quietly. It's the house, your childhood home. Odette nodded slowly. I memorized it as a child, the way you memorize your own address without ever trying to. After Wesley died, I started calling it every New Year's Eve, at the exact time the fire started. I don't know exactly why at first. I think some part of 15-year-old me believed, in some magical, irrational way, that if I called at the right moment, something might be different this time. That maybe he'd pick up. That maybe calling meant I hadn't fully left him alone in that house, even after everything. She paused, her eyes bright now, unashamed. It never became about actually reaching him. Not really. Not after the first few years. It just became the way I marked the night. A private way of saying his name, even without speaking it aloud. Louisa spent the following weeks researching the fire through old newspaper archives, understanding, with a specific professional caution born from her years in medicine, that she needed to approach this carefully, gathering information to better understand her mother's history, not to interrogate or second-guess a story Odette had only just, after 60 years, found the courage to share. She found a brief article from the local paper, dated the first week of January in the year Odette had described, confirming the outline of what her mother had told her. A house fire on New Year's Eve, one fatality, a 12-year-old boy. The cause attributed to a faulty space heater in an upstairs bedroom. The surviving 15-year-old daughter treated for smoke inhalation and released the same night. Louisa read the brief clinical newspaper account several times, feeling the specific disorienting grief of encountering her mother's most significant private trauma reduced to 4 short paragraphs in a decades-old local paper. The human weight of an entire family's devastation compressed into the flat, procedural language of local news reporting. She told Grant everything that evening, sitting together at their own kitchen table long after Milo had gone to his room. Grant listened without interrupting, his expression moving slowly through shock and then something more tender as he absorbed the full shape of what Louisa was describing. "You've never told Milo about any of this," he said, once she'd finished. "Not about Wesley, not about the fire. He doesn't know he had a great uncle at all." Louisa considered this, recognizing, with the specific discomfort of hearing an accurate observation, that she had unknowingly continued her family's habit of protective silence, never quite deciding not to tell Milo, simply never finding an obvious occasion to bring it up, the same passive avoidance that had apparently characterized her own family's handling of Wesley's death across 2 full generations. "I think I've been doing the same thing my mother did," Louisa admitted, not talking about something difficult, and calling the silence something other than what it actually is. She considered in the days that followed whether there was anything left to actually do with the information she now possessed, whether the story, having finally been spoken aloud after 60 years, was simply complete now, requiring nothing further beyond the family's fuller understanding of Odette's history. But something about the specific, unanswered nature of the yearly call kept working at her. The fact that her mother had spent 30 years dialing a number that connected, presumably, to whatever family currently occupied the rebuilt house on that same lot, letting it ring for exactly 1 minute every single year without ever once knowing who, if anyone, might be receiving those silent calls on the other end. She decided, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon several weeks later, to dial the number herself, not at midnight, not as any continuation of her mother's ritual, simply as an act of quiet, careful curiosity about who might currently live in the house that had once been her mother's childhood home. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm and slightly puzzled by the unfamiliar caller. "Hello?" Louisa introduced herself carefully, explaining, as clearly as she could manage, that she was calling about the house, that her mother had grown up there decades earlier, before a fire had led to it being rebuilt, and that she was hoping to learn more about the property's more recent history. The woman identified herself as Priya Sandoval, and there was a long pause on the line once Louisa finished her explanation, a pause that stretched long enough that Louisa began to wonder if she'd overstepped. "This is going to sound strange," Priya said finally, "but I think I need to tell you something. Every New Year's Eve, for as long as we've lived in this house, almost 12 years now, we get a phone call at midnight. Nobody ever speaks. It just rings through, and if we answer, there's silence on the other end for about a minute, and then it disconnects. We used to joke about it, actually. My husband calls it our New Year's ghost call. We assumed it was some kind of automated glitch or a wrong number that had simply become an accidental yearly habit for whoever was dialing it." She paused. "I think that might have been your mother." Louisa felt her breath catch. The specific vertigo of learning that a private, 30-year ritual her mother had carried out in careful solitude had, in fact, been quietly received on the other end the entire time. Not by an empty house, not by a disconnected line, but by an actual family who had built their own small, affectionate mythology around a call they'd never understood the true source of. "It was her," Louisa confirmed, her voice unsteady. "She lost her younger brother in the fire that happened in that house when she was a teenager. She's called every year since, at the exact time it happened, as a private way of remembering him. She's never known whether anyone was actually receiving the calls." Priya was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a specific tenderness Louisa hadn't expected from a stranger. "I'm so sorry for what your family went through," she said. "I want you to know we've never found it frightening, the calls, even before we understood what they meant. If anything, there was always something oddly comforting about it, though I could never explain why. I think, now that I know, it makes a strange kind of sense. Would you and your mother like to come visit? I know the house looks nothing like it would have looked back then, but I think it might mean something, seeing the place itself, even changed as it is." Louisa told her mother about the conversation with Priya 2 days later, choosing her words with the same careful deliberation she'd used weeks earlier, uncertain how the specific weight of this new information might land against Odette's still fragile memory and health. She had consulted, before this conversation, with Odette's physician, asking directly whether introducing significant emotional information carried any particular risk given her mother's cognitive state. The doctor had reassured her, gently, that meaningful, positive emotional connection generally posed considerably less risk than the alternative, the specific loneliness of carrying an unresolved grief in increasing isolation as memory itself became less reliable. Odette listened to Louisa's account of the phone call with an expression that moved slowly through several emotions Louisa found difficult to fully separate. Shock, first, and then something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. "Someone's been there the whole time," Odette said quietly, once Louisa had finished. "All these years, I always assumed I was just calling into an empty house or a disconnected line, that the calls simply went nowhere and meant nothing to anyone but me." She said it never felt frightening, Louisa said, even before she understood what it meant. She said there was something comforting about it somehow, without knowing why. "She's invited us to visit. I told her I'd need to ask you first, that it had to be your decision, not mine." Odette sat with this for a long moment, her eyes distant, and Louisa waited, understanding that this particular choice, whether to finally see the site of the worst night of her life, 60 years after the fact, now inhabited by strangers who had unknowingly kept a quiet, unexplained vigil for her private grief for over a decade, needed to belong entirely to her mother rather than being decided, however gently, on her behalf. "I'd like to go," Odette said finally. "I think I've spent 60 years calling a house I was too afraid to actually see again in person. I think I'd like to finally stand there, instead of just listening to it ring from a safe distance." Louisa told Milo the full story that same week, sitting with him in the quiet of his bedroom on an ordinary evening, breaking, deliberately and for the first time, the pattern of protective silence that had apparently shaped her own family's handling of this particular grief across 2 full generations. Milo listened with the specific, careful attention of a teenager encountering a piece of family history considerably heavier than anything he'd previously known to associate with his grandmother. "I have a great uncle I never knew about," he said, once Louisa had finished. I don't know. That's a lot to find out all at once." "I know," Louisa said. "I only found out myself a few weeks ago. I think our family has a habit of not talking about the hardest things, and I don't want to keep passing that habit down without at least trying to interrupt it somewhere." "Is that why you always made me check the smoke detectors twice?" Milo asked, something clicking into place behind his eyes. "And why we never really did fireworks, even though all my friends did?" Louisa considered this, recognizing with a specific tenderness the shape of an inheritance she had carried her entire adult life without ever understanding its true source. "I think so," she said. "I think I picked up a fear from your grandmother without ever knowing exactly what it was rooted in, and I passed some version of that fear on to you the same way, without meaning to, and without ever explaining it. I'd rather you understand where it actually comes from, now, instead of just inheriting the anxiety without the story behind it." Louisa and Odette visited the Sandoval house on a mild afternoon the following spring, Grant and Milo joining them for what had, by unspoken agreement, become a full family occasion rather than a private visit. The house itself, rebuilt decades earlier on the same foundation, bore no visible resemblance to whatever structure had stood there the night of the fire, a modern, comfortable home. Nothing about its current appearance suggesting the specific tragedy the property had once witnessed. Priya greeted them warmly at the door, and Odette stood for a long moment on the front step before finally stepping inside, her expression moving through something Louisa recognized as a complicated mixture of grief and a specific, cautious relief. "It doesn't look anything like it used to," Odette said quietly, standing in the entryway. "I don't know if that makes this easier or harder. I think I expected to feel something more specific walking in. Instead, I mostly just feel like I'm standing in someone else's home, which I suppose is exactly what I'm doing." "I think that might be all right," Priya said gently. "I don't think the house needs to feel like it used to for this to still mean something. I think it's more about knowing, now, that the calls were actually received, that your brother's memory has had somewhere real to land every single year, even before any of us understood what it meant." They sat together in the Sandoval's living room for several hours that afternoon, Odette sharing fragments of memory about the original house, the specific layout of rooms that no longer existed in any physical form, Wesley's particular laugh, a habit he'd had of humming to himself while he did his homework at the kitchen table. Priya's own family listened with careful, genuine attention, understanding, without needing it explicitly stated, that they were being offered something considerably more significant than an ordinary social visit, a chance to finally, fully receive a grief that had been quietly, faithfully directed toward their address for over a decade without their knowledge. Before they left that afternoon, Priya walked them out to the small backyard, where a young maple tree stood near the property line. "We planted this the year we moved in," she said, "just because we liked the spot. I don't think we knew, at the time, that we were planting it near wherever the original house might have stood. But I like to think now that it's grown up near exactly the right place." Odette stood beside the tree for a long moment, her hand resting lightly against its trunk, and Louisa watched her mother's face settle into an expression she hadn't seen before. Not simply grief, and not simply relief, but something that looked, finally, like a very old weight beginning, carefully and incompletely, to loosen. The following New Year's Eve, the family gathered again at Odette's house, the same modest tradition repeated as it had been for decades. Quiet, close, no fireworks, no loud countdown party. But this year, at 3 minutes to midnight, instead of disappearing alone to the study, Odette gathered the whole family around her in the living room, Milo included, and retrieved the worn address book from its familiar drawer, opening it this time without any hesitation. Having practiced finding the page several times in the preceding weeks, specifically so the search would not fail her again. She dialed the number on speakerphone this time. The family gathered close around her, and when Priya answered on the second ring, her voice warm and immediately recognizing the caller, Odette spoke into the receiver for the first time in 60 years of dialing that exact sequence of digits. "Happy New Year," she said, her voice steady. "I wanted you to actually hear my voice this time, instead of just the silence." "Happy New Year," Priya said back, warmth audible even through the thin connection. "We've been looking forward to this call all year, if I'm honest. It doesn't feel like a ghost call anymore. It just feels like family checking in." The two families spoke for several minutes, exchanging brief updates, the specific ease of two households that had built, over the preceding year, something considerably warmer than the accidental, unexplained connection that had unknowingly linked them for over a decade beforehand. When the call ended, Odette closed the address book slowly and returned it to its drawer, and Milo, watching his grandmother with a new, careful attentiveness, asked quietly whether they might keep making the call every year, together, as a family, rather than letting it remain something private and unspoken. "I think I'd like that," Odette said, her eyes bright. "I think, after 60 years of making that call entirely alone, I'm ready for it to belong to all of us instead." She looked around the room. Her daughter, her son-in-law, her grandson, the ordinary warm chaos of a family gathered together at the turning of another year, and thought, for the first time in 6 decades, not primarily of the specific, unbearable minutes she had once left her younger brother alone in a house that no longer existed in any physical form, but of the small maple tree now growing near wherever that house had once stood, and the family who had unknowingly kept faithful watch over her grief for over a decade before either side had understood what, exactly, was being carried across that quiet, unanswered line. Some calls ring for years before anyone thinks to ask who might be listening on the other end, and some griefs, carried alone for decades out of habit rather than necessity, are only waiting for someone brave enough to finally ask the question that lets them be carried, at last, together.